Jim, thanks very much for coming in to see us here in Queally's bar in Miltown. You might just tell us a bit about your background in music, where you're from and how you got into music and singing.
Right. Well, I was born in Liverpool, and but my parents Irish by heritage, and you heard a few songs at home. Usually, the political songs. My dad particularly was involved in Republican politics in Liverpool, and you heard the songs, but they never really registered as being anything but something you heard around the house. Oh, loads of Michael Coleman records. We lived in a household where a huge collection of Michael Coleman records, but it didn't register as anything, really. And I was into jazz in Liverpool, and the Cavern in Liverpool was the jazz centre. It was one of the best jazz clubs in Britain at the time, and that became overrun with Beatles. It was just taken over by the pop scene, and I'd become hooked on live music, on actually sitting and listening. And there was a club called the Spinners Club in central Liverpool, and I started going to that. And I was quite smitten for about a year, 18 months, but the stuff was rather samey, rather lightweight, and I was virtually on the way out. And one night I arrived, and it was more or less to be the last night. I was not going to bother after that. And there was a huge queue on the stairs, going out, right down the stairs, onto the street outside. And the guests were two people I'd never heard of, Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger. And I was smitten. I really was. I was not. It was so different. And so I hung around a bit, and eventually I moved from Liverpool to Manchester because it was a good, strong, traditional scene there. And it was there that Terry Whelan, a bloke named Terry Whelan, one of the stalwarts of the scene, introduced me to Ewan and Peggy one night. And we sort of hit it off immediately. Ewan asked me first to his home. I was running a singer's workshop. And Ewan said, well, if you only use our recordings, there's some there you can come down, stay with us for the weekend and take some recording to help. And then eventually Ewan invited me to join his workshop, the Critics Group. So I moved to London. I lived with them for about 2 weeks. It was ridiculous. I should have been looking for work and somewhere to live. And Ewan, it was a blazing hot summer, and Ewan was obsessed with talking to somebody. And we'd go out and do 5 minutes work weeding in the back garden. And then we'd sit and I think it was odd. I was never much of a singer in those days, but Ewan was quite taken by the idea that I got my hands dirty at work. I was an electrician. I'd served my time on the docks in Liverpool. And B, that my father had volunteered to fight in Spain. And we sort of hit it off. And I was in the Critics Group for 2 years. I met Pat there.
When
Pat and I got together. Pat was already a member.
When was that? Sorry to cut across.
Sorry?
When was this? When did you...
I moved to London 1969. The Critics Group ended in the end of 1971. And Pat and I were together by then. And we set up our own workshop, the London Singers Workshop. That lasted for 15 years. It actually lasted longer than the Critics Group. I became archivist and amassed a huge, obscenely large private collection. People just threw recordings. People like Hugh Shields, Tommy Munley, who I'd got to know various ways, started giving material, and I amassed a huge archive. And when the Singers Workshop, I inherited the archive, and I still have the responsibility of passing that on, which I'm doing as well as I can manage. 1973, Pat and I were sitting at home listening to some literary program on the radio on Sunday afternoon, and there's a guy named Jeremy Sanford. He was a sort of progressive playwright, writer, and activist, and he had just written a book. He hadn't written it. He assembled a series of interviews with travellers. The book was called Gypsies. And one of those chapters, an entire chapter, was called 8 Weeks of a Childhood. And it was written by a traveller named Pops Johnny Connors. Johnny had written it while he was in prison. He was in prison for his activities, travellers' rights activities, and he'd been taught to write. And one of the exercises he'd been given was to write an essay. So he wrote this. And it's a magnificent essay. It's still, all these years later, is still a magnificent essay. And then in the interview with Sanford, this voice came over the radio, and it was Pops Johnny singing. He made songs himself, and he obviously came from a traditional background. And it happened he was camping, he was illegally stopping Shepherd's Bush about 3 miles away from where we were living at the time. And myself and a member of the Critics Group, a guy named Dennis Turner, decided to go and see him. We rather male chauvinistically decided that the travellers were rather sort of misogynistic in their attitude. So we persuaded Pat not to come. It was a mistake. It really was. But anyway, Dennis and I went along. Pops Johnny virtually dragged us in, sat us down, and talked at us. He talked and he sang. And he sang fine. He sang a stack of songs. He gave us about 20 odd songs. But he talked. And the first thing he said persuaded us that there was far more to record than just the songs. Pops Johnny sang this ballad, 3 centuries old ballad, Lord Randall. No, Edward. The ballad tells of how a brother goes out with his 2 brothers, go out hunting, and one of them kills the other one, comes back home, and the mother questions him and says, well, what happened? Where's your brother? And he makes a number of excuses. And then confesses and is banished. And Pops Johnny said, it was really a remarkable statement. He said, well, I call that the Ballad of Cain and Abel. He said, that's how travellers started. They were banished on the road. And it became this ballad became a origin legend, travellers' origin. So Johnny decided us that we would interview as much as we had a list of contacts, possibly contacts, and Dennis and I sat down for 18 months. We stopped, sat down for 18 months, and formed a plan of work, how we were going to go. We recorded other people with Johnny, his brother-in-law, Bill Cassidy. You know little Bill Cassidy. And magnificent singer, absolutely stunning singer. No idea how old little Bill was. He looked about 18, but he had a floor full of children, you know. And they're this rather broken down Shannon style of singing. And they passed us from one to the other. And it was strange. We'd go along, they'd tell us so-and-so on that site, and we'd go along to the site. And they were treated with a bit of suspicion at first. Who are you? Are you the WOBs? Police, first thing they asked. Are you the students? No. Are you the WOBs? Are you social workers? And then, are you the students? And Dennis was a teacher. I was still being an electrician. And that's what we became. We became students. They took us in. 1975, we met Mikey McCarthy. He was in a bar in West Drayton, just outside of London. And we thought he was a group of men talking. The lady said, a travelling woman we knew, who turned out to be Mikey's sister, pointed and said, that man knows songs. And we went along, and we thought they were talking. They were down on their haunches up again, with the pool table in front of them. And Mikey was actually singing and telling stories. And that was 1975. And we recorded Mikey solidly from 1975 to 2004. And he continued to fill tape after tape with songs, with stories, with information. Mikey was a ballad seller. He sold ballads around the fair, and he described the process of taking his father's songs into a printer, and he'd either have somebody scribble down the words, because he very rudimentary literary abilities, or he'd recite them over the counter in somewhere like Tralee, and your man would write them down, and they would sell them on the street. Now that's a fairly unique description. There aren't many descriptions of the ballads actually being made to be sold. We asked Mikey, do you ever hear of anybody making songs to be sold on the ballad? He says, why? He says, plenty of our own. We just took our own songs. And Mikey was just an amazing man. We met Mary Delaney about 1977. Mary was incredible. A blind travelling woman who'd brought up 16 children on the road. She was camped on a site in West Drayton with Mikey, and we walked down. At the bottom of the site, the field, was the main line, railway line, going from London to the West Country, and there was a train going by every 3 or 4 minutes, you know. And we talked to Mary, and she says, "You won't like my songs," she said, "they're too old." And she virtually dragged us, this blind woman dragged us across the field, singing as she went. And I had the tape recorder going, and I was holding the mic, and she was singing bits and pieces of these ancient ballads, you know. Again, Lord Randall was her top ballad, Buried in Kilkenny, she called it. She sang as a bit of a song. My brother built me a Bancy Bower. It's a fragment of a ballad that has virtually disappeared, Famous Flower of Serving Men. It was common in Scotland. There was Mary with this. And again, with Mary, she just sang out, and she was an unbelievable woman. She had an accident, and she was very badly hurt, and the council in their wisdom decided she wasn't fit to bring her school-aged children up. So she went back and kidnapped all 6 of them out of care, moved into a flat. Hackney Council were very good with the travellers, moved into a flat and had them educated, sent them to school. And this woman, this blind woman, would sit at home. She couldn't even stare at the wall. She was stone blind. And she sat all day, and she was screaming for company. And Dennis and I turned up one night at the flat, and she literally hauled us in. Have you got the tape recorder? Hauled us in, and she sang this Buried in Kilkenny, and all the misery she was feeling at that point was poured into that song. You could cut your feet walking over it, you know. And sorry.
Oh no, it's brilliant. And did you find that when you made repeated visits to people like Mary Delaney and Mikey McCarthy, and you were going through this recording process, were they engaged in the recording process? Was it helping them recall songs and stories?
Were they?
Was the recording process that you were doing with them, was it like helping them recall songs, and was it making them think more about songs that they knew?
Well, the thing is about the Travellers, people forget, at the time, they still had an oral tradition. They were still not only singing the old songs and telling the old story, but they were still making songs. They were made, it was very much alive. Now that disappeared very quickly when they got televisions. So there was really no problem. They were just doing what they did naturally, you know. They just sang. And it was never, ever a problem to get songs from them. We turned up, Mary's kids were late teenagers. They were a pair of villains. They were great kids. And we turned up at the pub one night to see them and to meet Mary. And as we walked through the door, Pat and I, they burst out laughing. And we said, "What's the matter?" She said, "We were in here last night till 2 o'clock in the morning," she said. "And as we were going home, we had to drag Mary off. She wanted to find a telephone. She'd remembered some songs and she wanted to phone us at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was it was an urgency. I should say, you know, at the same time we were doing this, we started to visit Clare, and they were yearly visits. What you had is a different situation in Clare. You had a situation you didn't have in England. Nobody had been part of an oral tradition. None of the old singers had. It had gone. It had gone at the time of Cecil Sharp. The oral tradition in England had gone. So they were remembering songs from people who they'd learned were remembering songs. It wasn't in any way. The Travellers were a living, thriving tradition, you know, still making songs. And that seemed to be, this making songs seems to be an essential sign that the tradition was still alive. Ireland has a massive, massive local song-making tradition. I think very much neglected. It's people made songs naturally. People made songs. An old fella up in North Clare told us, in those days, he said, if somebody farted in church, somebody made a song about it. You know, that's the way it was. It was a natural process. You know, it's a bit of a diversion, but when they excavated the ruins of Pompeii, they discovered poetic graffiti in the wall, almost certainly made by educated slaves, complaining about the price in the local brothels, about the price of food in the market. People made songs naturally. It's part of their DNA. And that is an essential sort of way of understanding how these songs got made. You know, they made songs.
So you were recording members of the travelling community in London in the 1970s, and then you were also starting to make visits to Clare in the 1970s.
Yeah, we in fact started recording Pops Johnny in 1973. We came to Clare in the same year to the Flower in the stall. And Pat recognised Willie Clancy was at the Flower. And so we followed him after the Flowers finished. We followed him up to Miltown and we walked into Frails around the corner. And he'd gone. He went off with Festy Conlon. The two of them went off up the country. We never got to meet Willie. And remember, it was peeing down with rain. We came out of Frails, looked up and down the street. It's fuck all here worth hanging round for. So we pushed off, trying to catch up with Willie. And after that year, Willie died. And we started to... The first recording session we did in Clare was in fact in Ollie Conway's pub. We'd met Ollie in the bar in Queally. And the first thing that happened in the bar was Junior Crane was playing with they call them the Stiff Six, the local players. And Junior saw us listening And he came over and he said, "Are you interested in the music?" We said yes, and he invited us to the Crosses of Anna the following Tuesday, and we sat for a glorious 2 hours while Junior sang. He told stories and he played for us, along with a friend, John Joe Healy, who we later got to know in London. Then that same week, we'd heard about Ollie. So we went to see him, and Ollie said, "Well, come along on the Friday," I think it was. And we turned up on the Friday, and he'd assembled a gang of locals. He sang, about 4 or 5 people sang. A wonderful man named Josie Baker, terrified, absolutely petrified of the tape recorder. He sat there with his pipe in his mouth, and the pipe was shaking. And Josie sang beautiful song. I've never come across it. I can't find it. It's called Kilrush, and it's an ashling. You know, one of the ashlings. And we never come across it. And that was really the start. The following year we deliberately came the year, a month after the Willie Week, because we knew they would be involved. And then that started, and people just sang for us. And it was, you know, this was a nest of songbirds. You had Martin Reedy up the mountain. You had Straighty Flanagan. You had Tom Lennon. Tom Lennon was a phenomenon, you know.
And what was your connection that brought you to Clare when you came to Ireland? What was the connection that made Clare the place you came to?
Well, Clare was the Willie Clancy School that decided us to come back. John Faulkner and Sandra Kerr were 2 members of the critics group, and they told us about Tom Lenihan, and we came and we visited Tom. And Clare, my family are from the other side of Ireland, you know, so there's no connection at all with this part of the world. And it just became our summertime home, you know. It was only for 2 weeks. We seldom came during the Willie Week. We did a few, and we recorded the second week. Tom Munley was extremely helpful, but Tom his job was to headhunt songs. That was his remit from the folklore department. We wanted to talk, and we started off with a man in Kilshanny, a man named Pat McNamara. Wonderful, big storyteller, hour-long stories. And nobody knew he sang. He rattled off 60 songs, and he literally rattled them off. And it was fascinating. Considine's pub in Kilshanny. Yeah. Mrs. Considine, it was a bar then, it became a hotel later, and a shop, combined shop. And Mrs. Considine would carefully lift the bell off the shop door so the recordings wouldn't be... but she wouldn't let Pat tell stories. She refused to let Pat tell his stories, because Pat, in the old days, they'd all get there, and Pat would look at the clock and he'd calculate when Mrs. Considine was about to close, and he would launch into his longest story. He'd launch into an hour-long story, anyway. She said no more. She was a lovely lady. She'd been a nurse in Dublin, a student nurse in Dublin during Easter week. So she went along to support the lads, you know. Anyway.
Yeah. And so you knew Tom Munnelly well, and you knew Shields well. Were you all kind of, and you and Pat were actively collecting in London and Clare. Were you all kind of like sharing?
Not so much with Hugh. Hugh was in Dublin.
Okay.
We were friendly enough. When we had Singers Workshop, Hugh was one of the people who sent us material. But Tom and Pat and I became friends for 30 years, and that died when Tom died, you know. Tom came over to visit us in London. He had a bit of a rough time. He brought storytellers over for a storytelling festival, and Tom was bursting to get out and have a curry and look at the bookshops. And he took Francie Kennelly. And all Francie wanted to do was eat bacon and cabbage and look in the vegetable shops to see what. But you know, we were great friends. And Tom and I would come in this bar and we'd drink till Tom threw us out. Tom Queally threw us out. We'd go next door. And we would sit next door in Mary's to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and argue. We disagreed on a hell of a lot of things. You know, Tom wasn't particularly into the sort of psychology of singing. It wasn't his job anyway, you know. And we argued about it, but it was like friends. Things like that don't matter. You stayed friends, you know.
But that's interesting. You had different aims as collectors.
Oh yeah, very much. And that was down to McCall and the Critics Group. McCall said, as a singer, you can learn a song and sing it out. But if you lift the corner of the song to find out what's underneath, it will last you forever. And that's what we did. We analysed the songs. We analysed the background of the song. I've just done sort of 2 years research on the history carried by our traditional songs. I've given 2 lectures and I've written an article for a local history magazine, The Other Clare, on this. There is a massive amount of information carried by those songs. You know, and quite often the history carried is forgotten or it was never noted. We recorded a man named Mikey Kelleher in London. Mikey was born out on Mutton Island here, just off the coast. He lived in Queally. And we met him in Deptford. Again, nobody knew he sang. He absorbed 70-odd songs. He wouldn't sing at home. His wife didn't even know he sang. And we sit in the back of the car. He'd sit in the car, we had the Mini at the time, in the back streets of Deptford, and we recorded him. When we finally met Mary, his wife, she said, "Oh, you're the fellas who were recording him." She said, he used to come home at night, sit up in bed and sing. He'd rehearse the songs so he'd have another lot for his next time. She said to him, "You're going cracked like your mother." You know, but Mikey, sorry, I diverse all the time. Mikey had a song called The Quilty Burning. And it tells of during the time when the Tans over here, the local Republicans did a campaign against the RIC was cooperating with the Tans, and in protest, they did an arson attack on the barracks in Quilty. It was only a little house then, and it probably nobody knows about it. Nobody remembers it. It's happening, but Mikey sang us an 8-verse song about it. That's the only record of that event occurring. Nobody remembers it. And he told us how it was made. He said 4 local young lads, fishermen and farmers, stood at Quilty Cross one evening throwing verses at each other. And they threw verses until they came up with an 8-verse song. And I played it to John Joe Healy. John Joe Healy lived in London. He was from Quilty. And I played it to John Joe. We sat in his shed at the back of the house. And he came to verse 7. He said, "That's my father he's singing about." You know, it's that type of thing that all the time hit you. You know, and
yes, that was important for you to collect that information over the years. That kind of the stories behind the songs.
Yeah.
And just to go back a little bit, you were speaking about when you were collecting from the travelling community that was based in London. You said that your oral tradition was very alive when you first collected, but you said it changed quite quickly. Maybe you might just tell us a bit about that change, how you saw that change in the travelling community.
Change from
the oral tradition to when radio and TV started to have its influence.
Well, that was the thing. In 1973, you could go and sit at a fireside session. We had some remarkable fireside sessions. One night with Pops Johnny, adjacent to London Airport. We'd been in the pub, recorded Johnny, and about 10:30, closing time, he said, "I want you to meet my brother-in-law, Billy, little Bill." So we drove out to Hayes, about 5 miles outside of London. And they're in the field, big field. Big fire going. And everybody slightly tipsy, including me. Dennis was the driver, so I was quite tipsy, and I was holding the microphone somewhat unsteadily, with planes taking off every 4 minutes. It's a surreal situation. And right in the middle of it, this big man obviously didn't like what was happening. And he, very resentful, big hands like meat hooks, honestly, big man. And he kept sort of bumping into us and saying, aren't we the quaint old people then? And Pops Johnny spotted this and he said, "You'll be wanting to record Paddy then." And Paddy got up in front of the microphone and he sang, "You will remember Vienna and the roses of Heidelberg," in this light opera style, this huge man. And we became great friends. It's that type of thing, you know. And when we had the break, we had an 18-month break, and when we came back, we walked onto a site and we followed some of the people we'd already been recording. And it was in West London again, West Drayton. And we came onto the site. Total silence. Not anybody to be seen. And all the caravan, all the trailers, the glowing light of a television. It had stopped virtually within 18 months. And we were interviewing Mikey in like mad. The problem with interviewing Mike Ian, we would spend the night with the tape recorder and then we'd go to the pub and it would kick off again. And you'd have to remember what we talked about in the pub because he never stopped. And he said one night, he says, people of my generation, he was only 47 at the time, people of my generation were dying of loneliness. Nobody wants to sing anymore. Nobody wants to talk. The kids are playing pool or listening to the jukebox. And it had gone. It really had plummeted that quickly. And there were a few diehards, and what we were doing in a way, we were supplying an ear for people who wanted to sing. The desperation, both here in Clare and among the travellers, to give us a song so they didn't go because they knew they were going, they were dying, and they wanted. This desperation. Martin Reedy up in Kilshanny, in Tulloch-a-Boy, way up in the mountain there, an old bachelor, and we sat there one night after recording session, and he said, he says, I was delighted when you fellas started to visit. He says, I was so worried that my songs were going to die out, he says, that I was teaching the dog to sing them. It was that sort of urgency all the time, and we got that again and again and again. Pat McNamara gave us a list, last time we saw it, gave us a list of songs and stories, said, these are the ones I haven't recorded for you yet, he says, if I'm not here next year, come up to the graveyard and I'll tell them up to you. It's that sort of urgency. It's very moving, It's difficult to talk about sometimes because it's very moving. And, it was just magic when Clare County Library actually took the songs and put about 500 of them online.
So all those singers, the singers in London, from the travelling community, and the singers here in Clare, they were like really engaged in the process. It was important. It was as important to them as it was to you.
Yeah.
By the sounds of it,
It's that's beginning to happen now with the travellers stuff. There's a scouser like me, Peter Malarkey. He's moved back to Ireland and he's settled in Carsavine, and he became smitten with the bits and pieces on the internet Mike Ian put up. And Carsavine is where Mike Ian was born. He was born on the Fergreen there. And he has been working to get the local library in Carsavine doing things with it. So it's beginning to come together,
Yeah. Your collection has already been very influential to many generations of singers. I know that back in the 80s, that people like June Tabor and Mandy Pryor were learning songs that you recorded from Mary Delaney.
Yeah.
And now there's current generations of singers. The younger generations are using your collections. Both the Clare
what's
songs.
it? Lancome.
Yeah.
What's it's got the recordings?
Rady.
And now I'm not particularly smitten with Lancome. It's not. But no objection to them doing what they do. It's just not for me, But they have now been honest enough to say we are not a traditional group. They were interviewed by one of the folk journalists here, and they Ian said we're not a folk group, what we're doing now is a mixture, krautrock, punk. They're doing it, and that's great. That's honest. You know, when the groups got hold, I'm showing my conservatism now. When the electric groups got hold of the music, they turned it into something else. Our tradition, Ireland less so than England, but England is a storytelling tradition. The storytelling, the songs were made to pass on information, to tell stories. They weren't entertainment, because there's nothing entertaining about a young woman being beaten to death by her family because she chooses the wrong fella. But that's one of the oldest ballads. Tifty's Annie is an 18th century ballad, Scots ballad. They are, I'm convinced that they were made by people who are saying, this is who we were, this is what we did, and this is what was done to us. They are songs describing, you know, whole swathes of history are covered by the folk songs. Now, Ireland has a slightly different tradition. The Irish language songing tradition is a musical and poetic one. It's not strictly storytelling. They shuffle a song like the Connerys. If it was made in England, it would be about four fellas who were hijacked for committing a crime and sent to Australia, and that is how a songmaker in England would have made it. And they rather shuffle around it, my curses type of thing. They comment on it. The songmakers commented on the story as well, and that's a basic difference. And when the groups got hold of this, they made it something else, totally. You know, Still I Span was more akin to pop music than it was. Now, again, you can't object to that, you know. George Butterworth, the English composer, was using folk tunes to make beautiful orchestral music in Britain. Vaughan Williams was doing the same. It's not an objection, it's just pointing out that what they're doing is not tradition, it's not the folk.
Yeah. So what's important to you, based on your years of collecting and involvement with traditional folk singing, what's important to you that you would like to see carried forward?
Well, the songs certainly, but the point is that the old singers had a way of singing that didn't fall in with the way a lot of the younger singers are singing now. They told the stories. Tom Lennon said this. We're telling the stories. They told us. Now, what they're doing is, in my opinion, over-accompanying the stuff. You have a sort of half-a-minute overture before the ballad begins, and then you get after verse 3, and you get another quarter of a minute interval, musical interval. That's no way to tell a story. The old guys started and went through, finished. They didn't accompany. Ireland could easily have accompanied. It had a strong instrumental tradition. They did not accompany their songs. There's nothing wrong with accompanying. In fact, a good accompaniment can enhance a song, but it seldom is good enough. It becomes a distraction. The old singers did something else. They sang as they spoke. An English revival singer, As I rode out one midsummer morning. The Phil Tanner sang the same song. As I rode out one midsummer's morning. As they spoke, they put the full stops in. They put the commas in the right place, and it was a constant flow. The song was a flow. It held together as a story. Joe Heaney talked about tell me a song. You know, that's what they did, and that's what I think has largely been missed. Certainly in England. I'm hoping that the youngsters will pick up not just the songs, but the way how the singers. Most of the old singers were well past their sell day by day. You know, we recorded Joe Queally back in 1975, and we recently recorded him again. He was 97, and he's passed, but he hadn't lost that ability to tell a song, and that's, for me, that is the secret of good singing. That's good. I want the songs to survive. I want them to survive and be recognised for what they are, the voice of the people, because that's what they are. That's what they've always been called, the voice of the people. And that's, you know, folk. It's a bit of a problem with Ireland with the term folk. They talk about the tradition and folk being two different types of song. They're not. Folk and tradition are two sides of the same coin. The tradition is the process of making, passing on, and remaking the songs, the oral tradition. The folk are the people who made them. The term folk was invented in 1837 by a guy named William Tom, an Englishman, to describe the artifacts that they were gentlemen writing down, the stories, the customs, and he devised the term folklore, and that's what it was about.
Jim, great to hear you're still collecting, and thanks very much for the interview. And I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say, just as a concluding remark, or anything else that's important to you that you'd like to mention.
What can you say? Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alan.